again to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show we have Julie Megler, and Julie is with Erie. We get into quite a bit in the show. Organization out of the San Francisco Bay Area doing really cool integration and psychedelic work. Julie is a nurse practitioner and has a really interesting perspective on the psychedelic space. She spent a lot of time doing her own personal work and now works with people doing integration, and healthcare, has her own private practice. So yeah, really cool interview. We really appreciated having her on the show. Can't wait to talk to more people with Erie. They're doing some really interesting stuff. Yeah, the full name of Erie is Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education. erievision.org is the website. And again, the guest is Julie Megler, NP. She got a bunch of letters after her name, actually. So check that out in the show, the post on our website for more. And she's got some really cool other media done as well. And it looks like she's done some work down at the Temple of the Way of Light, Ayahuasca Retreat Center in Peru. And that's pretty cool. We've got a YouTube link to her review of a 12-day retreat she did down there. 12 days is pretty substantial. It's no joke. So other announcements, we've got some workshops coming up here in Colorado. One's in Breckenridge, June 4, July 8, and August 6. We've got a Friday to Sunday event in Lyons, Colorado, a little north of Boulder. It's kind of the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. That starts June 23. I think it's 23 through 25. And it's not just our breathwork method. It's I think there's some rebirthing, which is a very different spin on breathwork. And there's some yoga, meditation instruction. I think there's hiking available on site, a beautiful river. I think it's a nice isolated ranch. So I'm really excited to check this space out because it might work out great for future workshops. Boston Holotropic has some workshops coming up in Belmont, Massachusetts, just slightly outside of Somerville. And so if you know the area, it goes like Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Belmont. So that's June 2 and 3. Check that out at bostonholotropic.com. Those are our friends that we've been practicing breathwork with for a long time. And I think that's it. Keep an ear to the ground for news about our new and improved integration course coming up in a few weeks. I think we're going to launch that one in July, and really looking forward to it. Also, we had a book club winner, book giveaway winner. It was Eric, who we met on Reddit, and really appreciate him sharing so much. He spread the word like no one else really, I don't think, ever could. It's amazing. So thank you, Eric. Really looking forward to connecting on that course, and really hope you enjoy all these Groff books and other stuff too. All right, now for Julie Megler, thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Welcome to Psychedelics Today with your hosts Kyle and Joe. Today we're here with Julie Megler. You're board secretary over at Erie, which is the Entheogenic Research Integration Education over in California. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here with you guys. I'm a big fan of your guys' mission of just kind of getting the word out on integration because it's such an important piece of this work. Yeah, definitely important. Could you give us a little background about how you got involved in this field of work? Yeah, definitely. Let's see, how far back to go? I was joking during the psychedelic science conference during the workshop that, my experience level when it comes to entheogens is everything from fish shows to going down to the jungle and doing diets. So the interest has been there since I was a teenager, and I've learned a lot of things along the way, and some of them I learned lessons the hard way. So part of the interest in this work has been, how can I bring forth what lessons I learned, and some of them being the harder ones, and just educate people so that, they don't have to make the same pitfalls that I did. But the thing that really motivated me was first heard about MAPS when I was in nursing school, and I read their article about, so you want to become a psychedelic researcher. And they talked about how the number one thing to do was to get your license. So I was feeling a little disenchanted by nursing school at that moment. And it was like the thing that motivated me. It was like, okay, keep your mind on the end goal, get through nursing school, have your license, and you'll find a way to incorporate this work into your life. And then about 5 years ago, I was on a retreat with Gabor Mate down in Mexico, where he does some work where he does a combination of, he works with two ayahuasca healers, and they do the ceremonies, and then he does processing during the day. And that was the first time I'd really heard about this concept of integration. And I had some pretty big and pretty impactful experiences that I would say to this day I'm still integrating 5 years later. And it really made me realize the importance of, it's not that you can just walk out of these experiences. You need to really, it becomes a way of life to make the transformation and the changes that you want to make these a much more meaningful experience.
Right. Yeah, it's a ever-long process.
Yeah, for sure.
So to backtrack a little bit, when you were in nursing school, you said you kind of wanted to get involved. Sometimes we get questions. People are always reaching out, like, how do I get involved? Like, what type of credentials do I need? What type of avenue could I go down to get involved in this psychedelic work? Do you have any insights for some of the listeners that might be interested? And now, with MAPS going towards like phase 3 with their MDMA studies, I know this is like a growing field. So
I feel like I have a two-part answer to that. And one of the things that we at Erie are really trying to advocate for is that, science and medicine are a really important way for us to move forward in terms of getting this message out to the general world. However, it also really narrows the scope of psychedelic work. There's been traditions and cultures and people working in the underground that are non-licensed individuals that have a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge and a lot to offer to this work. So I just kind of had the disclaimer that while I went the licensure route, that it's really important to emphasize and I think make space for not driving psychedelics just into the clinical world. While from a political standpoint, it's really important, I think it's also important to really validate the importance of the non-clinical people and traditions that are involved. But from a personal standpoint, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was just kind of curious and knew that I wanted to be involved in some sort of way. So I first got licensed in family medicine as a nurse practitioner, and then had the curiosity of how to incorporate at some point in time psychedelics. So I went back and I did another postmaster's certificate in psychiatry, feeling that the mental health piece was going to be an important aspect. And I think that's kind of the world in which a lot of the integration work lives in. And, integration isn't necessarily therapy, but people are often in their integration process working with some pretty deep emotional experiences. So I think it depends on what capacity you want to be involved. I think being licensed can be really helpful if you want to be part of the upcoming MAPS research. And I also think that there's a lot you can do just via coaching and helping people from a coaching perspective and integration, which wouldn't require you to be licensed.
Right. Yeah. We just talked to Cherie not too long ago, the psychedelic integration coach. That was our last episode we put out. And I think we got into a conversation about whether going down the licensing route is right for somebody versus the coaching. So, yeah, thanks for that.
Are there any programs you like, coaching programs that you might point people to if they were interested in that kind of thing?
I don't know enough about coaching to necessarily speak to that myself. I'm in private practice, so I can speak a lot more to how being in private practice as a licensed person allows you to kind of explore these realms a little bit more.
Cool. Are there any licensed certs that might help inform somebody that wants to approach it in the licensure world that you're familiar with, or have you just kind of picked this up on your own over time?
There isn't a lot of information out there. This is such an emerging field that I think we're all kind of figuring it out together. So most of this has just been my own curiosity. And, in all honesty, I feel like one of the big things that I spoke about during the workshop and the panel at the Psychedelic Science Conference was how I think the biggest thing you can do for yourself if you're wanting to get into this work is really engaging in your own process of integration. It doesn't necessarily mean have this many entheogenic or psychedelic experiences before you can help facilitate something for someone. But it does mean, like, how deeply have you engaged in your own work? And you can only really help other people with their integration to the level of which you're integrated yourself. So I think for myself, like 5 years ago, I got super inspired, and I was like on the Gabor retreat, and I was like Gabor Mate's retreat, and I was like, I want to be doing this work with people. And then I just like fell face first into this really intense and long integration process for myself. And being on the other side of that now, I'm like, wow, that was really intense. But that's what's giving me the confidence and the wisdom to be able to work with people in a different capacity now. Because I really, really gave the attention that my own personal process needed first.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like that concept of the wounded healer, right? Kind of going through your own initiation and then coming out on the other side to teach those afterwards.
Yeah, or another way of saying it is that you can only take people as far as you've taken yourself.
Right. And I like that.
Yeah.
Cool.
What do you think of the kind of dichotomy between like actively guiding sessions and just being a sitter? I know that's like very different roles, and quote unquote different medicine. But what are your thoughts on that?
So you're talking specifically about being a guide versus being a sitter?
Well, so say for example how MAPS is doing a session with the the male-female pair, and versus kind of just being in the room and making sure they're not losing it and not actively trying to like coach them through it. Do you think there's still a place for just being a sitter in like a therapeutic exploratory process, or do you think we've kind of like progressed with these trials to the point where we should have therapist pair? I personally feel like it kind of is more democratic to have this kind of sitter thing, where it's not like you're not necessarily needing to be a super expert. But what do you think about this stuff?
I think this really depends on what context in which people are working in. Are we talking about the environment for studies and working with PTSD? In which case, I think having a guide to kind of help, there's specifically when you're working with trauma, there's ways to titrate and pendulate the experience so that you can help people get deeper into their material so healing can occur while also not pushing them too far too fast and not being too directive. In which case, I do think having a guide is beneficial. Now, if we're talking about people who are exploring on their own or traveling abroad, it depends on what you're working on. There can be a lot of healing and growing and exploring, and not just about healing and growth, but creativity that can emerge by just kind of being in that experience on your own. So, the context is important, as well as I think if you just for the sitter or the guide having really good discernment about when's kind of being overly directive and when's important to kind of sit back and let people work through their stuff. So, and I think it depends on what the person wants. Like having somebody who's more of a guide just doesn't work for some people and their personalities, and they don't want that sort of influence. And then other people do. They need that little bit of a nudge. So I don't think it's an either or as much as just what's the context, the environment, and what's the individual person's needs. But I do want to give the disclaimer that a lot of times when people, I think there's an important piece for people who have a lot of resistance to having a guide, to also asking the question and doing a little self-reflection of like, what's that resistance about? Because there usually is a piece to that for somebody to work with a little bit as well. So I do want to name that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Why do you think people would want to resist like having a guide or a sitter there?
I think that people's relationships with like an authoritative figure, people's relationships with therapeutic environments, and I think there's a lot of it is a stigma. It's really hard for our culture to be vulnerable, and there's a certain level of vulnerability that comes to there being a sitter there or a guide there for you, kind of seeing you in your rawest state, as well as you're easily influenced and suggestible in that state. And do you really trust the guide, trust the person? So I think trust is a big thing to look at as well.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting. Like doing breath work. Sometimes you'll go to a retreat and, you have a sitter and a pair. And sometimes like I've been with some random people and, kind of almost feeling uncomfortable, like, oh man, like I'm going to really open up and share like some really deep stuff with somebody I don't even know. And it's just really interesting while you're in that process, like you're doing the double bookkeeping thing of like going through your process, but also knowing you're in the room. It's really interesting to have somebody sit there. And I think engaging in that process over the past few years is really, I don't know, I really appreciate the aspect of somebody sitting there with me.
Yeah, me too. It's been a funny edge for myself because I'm one of those people who will just like open myself wide up and be like, sure, I'll throw myself into this. Like, I'll be vulnerable. What's there to lose? Like, there's so much we can learn through our vulnerability. And it's been important for me to actually put that in check for obviously my own safety reasons. I've been pretty discerning in that regard, but also more importantly, for me to not be judgmental of people who aren't in that place.
Let's maybe jump back a little bit. I keep getting this confused because we chatted with Larry a little bit about what Erie is and some of the groups that you do, but I realized it wasn't in a podcast form and it was for something else that we were doing. So could you explain what Erie, the mission of Erie is and what you guys are doing over there?
Yeah, definitely. So, as our name suggests, entheogenic research, integration, and education, we're kind of looking to do more of like the integration and the education pieces, not engaging in any formal research at this time. So we've been holding lectures and educational lectures and events. Typically, they're usually about once a month. Things have been a little bit slower this year as Larry's kind of working on finishing up his dissertation. Mm-hmm. But and that will be in a variety of topics, not just integration. So we like to bring in people from all sorts of backgrounds, everything from indigenous perspectives to academics to people from more medical environments to just kind of have a conversation. We do tend to have more of an audience that's more interested in the intentional use of psychedelics than on the recreational side, but we're open and welcome to all of the above. And then what our main goal is really developing the integration piece. So currently we hold peer integration circles about once a month. The long-term goal is to fundraise to open up an actual hub, a location for integration where we can be offering everything from classes and events to just having a library, spaces for people to kind of get creative and explore various topics of conversation. Like let's sit and just discuss like death and rebirth tonight and what's my experience been? How do we explore that? How do we explore the shadow side of this work? How do we, make sure that spiritual bypassing isn't happening? All the things that kind of come up with integration. And another key aspect to Erie's vision is that, we're all in this together. So how do we take this non-hierarchical approach? How are we taking a peer-to-peer approach where we're all learning from each other? We're very based in the community piece of integration. In cultures where these traditions are coming from, integration is inherent in the culture. So that's why integration isn't a thing. But we're so separated out as a culture that we need to come together so that we can feel supported and not feel isolated in these experiences and have the opportunity to be exchanging ideas. So that kind of non-hierarchical community approach is really what we're trying to create, while there's also a time and space for having some more facilitated type approaches as well, which we also welcome to that degrees, kind of having the kind of whole comprehensive approach, not just, like a therapeutic one-on-one session, but as well as how do we come together as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So right now, some of your main work is facilitating these peer groups and integration groups.
Yeah, exactly. So our We hold monthly peer integration circles, and then kind of the format of our peer integration circles is the people that are facilitating the group are really just there to hold the container. And we have a period of time for each person to share an experience. And there's certain guidelines about, sharing a personal experience and not externalizing, and no crosstalk, and using a talking stick, kind of like a council model. And then we open up, if people want, to a reflection period where then the rest of the group is there to offer some feedback or insights. We caution people not to give too much advice, to be respectful in their sharing and how they're sharing. But it ends up really engaging everybody in the conversation. And I'm always surprised by the wisdom in the group, because it doesn't matter if you've had 0 experiences or hundreds of experiences, there's something to learn from everyone. So it's a really simple way to bring everyone together.
That's great. I really like the peer model. What made you kind of form it that way versus like having an expert take the role and kind of give more of like a psychoeducation type group? I wasn't there when the model was originally made, because it started when Erie was still a student group at CIS. But essentially, there was some modeling around 12-step program dynamics, and how effective that is, and how AA is the founder of AA was highly influenced by some of his work with LSD as well. So, yeah. And like I said, there's definitely a time and place for more facilitated approaches. And the other reason why this model was produced was because we wanted something that people could easily take and replicate back in their homes. So it's so simple that if, we have a couple people that will travel up from the peninsula or from Tahoe and come to one of our groups, and then we're like, this is really simple. You can also create this back in Tahoe, back down in the peninsula, so you don't have to commute, and create your own community wherever you go. That's awesome. Yeah, I keep seeing little ones pop up. I know Cherie was part of Inner Space Integration. They had some stuff going on over here on the East Coast. The Center for Optimal Living has their integration groups. But yeah, I've been seeing like even smaller ones pop up all over the place. Are you training people or just kind of like educating people how to build a group if they want to take this places, or?
Yeah, we aren't necessarily training anyone. It's more of just like, if people have questions, we'll answer them, or we encourage them to come to some of our groups. We are looking to create a certificate program, cool, which would incorporate some more teaching. So ideally, as part of our fundraising, we want to create a curriculum and a certificate for people who are non-licensed, as well as possibly providing CE, continuing education credits, for people who are licensed, and having a certificate program for different approaches to integration, important like background education and ways of kind of incorporating it. So.
Oh, awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Cool. How about, I'm curious, integration is definitely this topic that's been popping up everywhere, and it's definitely seems like it's been trending in the psychedelic community. What would you say your definition of integration is?
Ooh, let me, we spent a lot of time on creating an actual definition for it. Cool. So give me 1 second. So a few years ago, Susanna Bustos, Dr. Natalie Metz, and I put together a list of integration guidelines for the Erie website. As part of that, and in creating those integration guidelines, just some good practices for preparation and how to take care of yourself before, during, and after an experience. We kind of came together with the Erie's definition of integration, which I'll read off to you guys, is integration refers to the process by which the material accessed and insights gained in an entheogenic experience are incorporated over time into one's life in a way that benefits the individual and their community. So that's kind of really wanting to emphasize that piece of kind of not just benefiting yourself, but also bringing that back home. a mentor of mine has a really simple definition of integration that I really love, which is weaving the mystical with the practical.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. No.
That's awesome. Wow, cool. Thanks for that definition.
There was a institute. Help me out here. The transpersonal. Institute for Trans.
Sophia now?
No, the actual international conference they do every handful of years.
Oh, okay.
I think it's just the International Transpersonal Association. They actually had like a themed conference years ago about re-enchanting the world. So kind of a similar theme there. Like everybody kind of like focusing on that. And that, in a lot of ways that's healing for sure. I was thinking about that today actually for a while. What is that function of having more, like, I don't know, magic, for lack of a better word, in your day-to-day thinking about stuff, as opposed to being really reductionist and rational and mechanical, Is there a benefit? I kind of tend to think there is. I'm sure it can go too far, can become pathological, but, you should have some of it, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. There's a article that Ken Tupper wrote years ago about wonder and awe, and how the importance of psychedelic and entheogenic work is bringing that aspect of wonder and awe back into your life. And I think that's really, really important. I always kind of joke with people, it's about keeping a foot in both worlds, right? So as you're kind of saying, like, how do you reawaken that magic and awe while also staying grounded in it, and not kind of floating away? As we can see out here sometimes in California, there's a lot of the quote California woo-woo sometimes.
Oh, totally. It's very present in Colorado. I'm sure there's plenty of it in New York as well. I don't know if there's any other hubs of woo, but there could be. Hubs of woo. That's a
good one. Cool. Probably the Arizona Gem Festival, I would guess, probably has. I hope nobody's judging me for making fun of that. I think I would love to go one year, but I'm sure it's got a lot of woo-woo.
I saw some pictures this year. They were very funny.
You're a nurse practitioner, so you see clients. I was just having a conversation on, like, integration seems like this topic within the field, but how could it play out for, say, just regular mental health workers? Like, I'm sure there's people that, they see patients that have had a difficult experience, but they don't really know how to work with that. Like, do you think that kind of trying to integrate this integration language into, like, mainstream mental health could be beneficial, or is there room for that?
This totally reminds me, I had a client years ago who had a huge mushroom journey. And had a hard time kind of grounding himself afterwards. And he ended up at Kaiser at one of their substance abuse groups. And I just, I felt really bad for the kid, because what he was working with wasn't a substance abuse problem. It was trying to ground after kind of blasting himself a little too far on mushrooms for what he was ready for, without kind of having anybody to hold the container for him at all. So I definitely think there's a place, because there's a huge difference. And I think one of the things that I appreciate the conversation around is the difference between harm reduction, risk reduction, and benefit enhancement. And harm reduction kind of takes this approach that there is the substance that you're working with is harmful. So how do you reduce the harmfulness of that? And then risk reduction, which is kind of, I first heard about in a conversation with the Zendo and Annie Oak, who runs the Full Circle Tea House, is this idea that there are risks to working with whatever medicine or substance you're working with, but it isn't necessarily inherently harmful. So how do you minimize the risks? Versus something like benefit enhancement, which is just kind of looking to seek what are the positive effects of working with this. So I think just bringing it into the mental health model, that there's a difference between those three things, and that just because somebody is working with the substance doesn't necessarily mean that that substance is inherently harmful. And how can you help educate people who are in the mental health system for whatever reason on, reducing the risks associated with it, as well as then, if the question that I always hear coming up when it comes to the mental health system is billing. Like how can you get insurance reimbursement for somebody's integration session?
Right.
Which is a little bit of a harder sell. And I think a problem with the system as a whole, but I think, just giving some people some basic education around educating people of like exploring what are the insights that you got from this experience, and how can you take those insights so that they can lead to some sort of, positive behavioral changes and benefits in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting with the insurance companies. Yeah, so it's always a problem, right? Yeah, and I think part of the reason why I asked that question is, I've spent some time in residential homes working and had people come in that might have taken too many drugs and kind of had some sort of break, and then it's like, is it pathology? Like, should we pathologize these things, or is it like a lack of integration, like they took a substance? And so I don't know, for me, it's like always going back and forth whether, mental health is viewing it as pathology or viewing it as somebody just had a really difficult experience, and now how do you work with that?
Yeah, who he spoke on the symposia stage. His name is Adam, and I'm blanking his last name. I met him down at the Temple of the Way of Light. He works for ICers, and he, I believe, is a psychologist or therapist, but also he has this big question of like, if people are having a break, we tend to not allow the space for that unfolding and pathologize really quickly. And what would the mental health system look like if we actually had the resources to take somebody in and let that whole process kind of emerge? Mm-hmm. And let them kind of go through whatever kind of more shamanic approach to looking at psychosis or various things really happen for somebody for whatever their kind of, what's it called? Spiritual emergence may be from that.
Are you familiar with the Groff stuff around that? Like that whole model of like, give them 40 days or something to kind of let that process play out?
I'm not super familiar with it. I've heard bits and pieces of it. But, I definitely know people and have spoken to people who like have had, quote, a psychotic episode post doing ayahuasca work in the jungle that emerged, took a couple of weeks to land from, but they're not necessarily like, schizophrenic or bipolar or psychotic. That was just a big process that needed to emerge for them. Mm-hmm. So the problem is resources, because it can be exhausting to take care of somebody when they're in that state, and making sure that they're safe and not going to harm themselves or anyone else.
Yeah, it's like 24/7 support. It's really tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like ideally you can let somebody go through that whole process, but creating a safe enough environment for them is the piece that makes it tricky.
Right. Yeah. And, if somebody does end up landing in residential, it seems like they are in a safe place. And, it seems like a good place to educate some of, the workers and mental health workers about these sort of spiritual emergence processes that come up, or they've had a background with substance use.
I'm going to give a shout out right now at this moment to Brian Anderson, who's a psychiatry resident at UCSF. Cool. Because he's done a really good job of educating a lot of people in the psychiatry department. And I had a conversation with him several months ago where he said that if somebody were to ever come through who was needing a higher level of medical care post a psychedelic experience, entheogenic experience, that he could actually have conversations with people. And if they were admitted to the psych unit at UCSF, to at least have people that are rotating through and checking in on them who'd be a little bit more open to those approaches. Which, if somebody's needing inpatient care at that point in time, to at least be in an inpatient facility where people are slightly open-minded is a huge step in the right direction.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that's part of maybe, have you guys ever thought about that with Erie, of doing more education for traditional mental health workers?
Yeah, we would definitely love to. I think it's a matter of just kind of developing the program to do that. But yeah.
Right.
I think that's also part. Yeah, developing the language, and part of one of the reasons why when we developed the certificate program, we would like CEUs to be available so that there's a reason to attract people from more conventional modalities to really see value and why learning in more depth about this work is important.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see at the conference how many people were able to have a professional excuse as care providers in very traditional settings to come there to Oakland and got CEUs for psychedelic material. I thought that was really cool, and probably one of the reasons why they had, I think it was more than 3,000 people attend. Pretty interesting. Were your workshops afterwards CEU or continuing ed related?
Yeah, actually, the integration workshop did provide CEUs for people, which was great. And I was super excited because my mom came out for the workshop.
Oh, nice.
And my parents are both psychedelic naive and have been very supportive of my interest in this work. And also, I think rightly so, having a little fear around the stigma of it all. But it was great for my mom to come to the workshop and be sitting like smack in the middle between a couple who the husband was a physician, a family practice doctor, and his wife was a lawyer in their like early 50s. I think it just really helped my mom see that there's a lot more value than she might realize, and it helped destigmatize it, which I think helped reduce a bit of her fear as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. So the professional presence was, I think, much more potent than maybe the New York Times article alluded to that came out a couple weeks ago about the conference.
Right.
That was a little rough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't seem like they had any pictures of like the actual like presentations. They showed like pictures of like the Zendo or like the pretty lights. And I was like, it seems like a little misrepresentation of what was going on.
You know what my personal sense was that whoever wrote the article, and I could just be making this up, but my sense is that whoever wrote the article didn't actually get entry into the conference itself.
Oh,
And was spending more time in the marketplace and the symposia stage and whatnot.
That would make sense because it was free and, there were talks going on there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I spent some time with that one of the New York Times employees that was there. She seemed interested. I just don't know that she knew like which way to go with it. And it wasn't it in the style section, not even in the science section of the Times?
I'm not too sure. And I mean, who knows? Some of it could have been attributed to their editor too. Mm-hmm. So how much of it was the reporters? I don't want to downplay their work because they may have done a fantastic job, and it just came down to what made the story.
Right. Yeah, I think, also just getting information out there. Like my mom came across an article last night. She wanted to send it to me. And, I think she was pretty, kind of psychedelic naive. And, that fear and stigma from the 60s still is left over. And, I think now that some of these articles are being published, people that are kind of scared of it are opening up a tiny bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely been true for my parents. And the New Yorker article that Michael Pollan did, was that a year or two ago now? I think that had a huge positive impact for the movement because he's so highly respected with his work and did such a good, thorough job in writing that article that people who are not typically interested or maybe even a bit judgmental of this work were able to open their minds up to it a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm seeing that we're getting close to time here. I know you have to run in maybe like 5 or so minutes. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on or any last closing remarks?
It doesn't have to be that final. We can have you on again in the future too.
Yay! Yeah, I think I would love to leave it open-ended, and not have it be that final. And yeah, I think the thing that I just want to stress in the closing remarks again is this kind of idea and concept that, this is an emerging field in a variety of ways. The psychedelic movement is re-emerging from being in the underground, and this concept of integration is kind of emerging for its first time, and we're all learning together. So the more that we all engage in conversation, and the more that we collaborate, and the more that we as a community as a whole come together, the more we can learn from it. And yeah, there's no kind of baseline. So there's a variety of different styles and approaches that all work, and the more space we make for all of that, I think just kind of the more we're going to be able to accomplish together. So thank you guys for being part of kind of curating a bit of that.
Trying our best, and thanks for recognizing it, and really looking forward to having you on it again. Where can people find you online, Julie? Yeah, so
probably the best places to find me online, you can shoot me an email at julie@erievision.org. So that's Julie at ERIEvision.org. And then the Erie website is erievision.org as well.
All right. Fantastic, Julie. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure.